What a time to be alive. Who would have thought that John Fetterman would be the one to make the most sense in the modern Democratic Party in a long time? But that's exactly what we got to see in his latest appearance with Bill Maher. The question was simple: what's behind John's falling out with the modern left? His answer as it regards the Democratic Party's response to the current war in the Middle East is the clearest window into the shift in his political thought. Just listen to John Fetterman in his own words before we dive deeper into it.
You said, I'm not a progressive, I'm a Democrat. What does that mean? What is that distinction? Because I don't think I've used the word progressive. I think I've said woke. I think there's a big difference between woke, and I know that word triggers a lot of people because it had a great beginning as a meaning, but words migrate, and it went to something else. I think there's a big difference between an old school liberal and a woke person. You say progressive Democrat. How do you describe this?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's like I've just say, and I've been saying that for years, actually. I said that, I didn't leave the label. It left me on that.
Right.
And that really, after it happened on October 7th, I really knew that that whole progressive stack would be blasted apart, and there's not going to be any kind of way how the Democrats are going to be able to reply to that kind of, respond to that kind of. And I really decided early on that I believe that was going to be the right side with Israel throughout all of that.
Honestly, is that even a surprise? The war that flared up in the Middle East in October has driven a straight wedge not just between the political right in America, but also increasingly the political left. And despite that fact, John Fetterman isn't an isolated example of someone that's distancing himself from the more woke strand of the party. He certainly is one of the most important ones. By the way, subscribe to the channel for more discussions like this. Now, I think it also even includes Bill Maher himself to a degree, as well as more broadly people like Anna Kasparian, who've had their run-ins with the strand of the left on issues like the gender debate. But when it comes to Fetterman himself, he's remarked before that his stroke nearly 20 months ago awakened him to the fact that there really was no point in trying to be inauthentic in his political identity. And it's since then that we've seen him make a slight pivot away from the political left and more toward the traditional liberal and democratic left wing that he probably remembers it as. And don't be thinking that the far left strand is going to take that lightly, because they can be just as vicious if you fall out of favor with them as the far right. We saw the most egregious example of that when leftist political commentator Kyle Kulinski just last week remarked about John Fetterman's medical condition and stroke, saying things like, quote, brain damage made him more conservative. Just take a look for yourself.
But look at the title. John Fetterman tells Maher that near-death experience freed him to speak out, and says progressivism, quote, left me. So in other words, after I got brain damage, I became conservative. Thank you, John. This is what many of us were saying. I felt like an asshole the first time I said it, right? I felt like a dick. But I said it. And lo and behold, later on, he says it.
It's truly a revelation to see that both the far left and far right almost mirror each other, not just in their explicit racism and closed-mindedness, but also their dogmatism and viciousness to anyone that dares fall out of line. It seems like as the walls close in on our political discourse, a very narrow window of options will actually remain viable. Now, I think someone like Bill Maher certainly is aware of that happening because he's particularly been criticized by his own Democratic friends for supposedly not following them down the rabbit hole of woke, intersectional friends on issues like race, gender, immigration, violent protests in 2020, as well as the rise of someone like Donald Trump in American politics. And increasingly, like John Fetterman, he's also come to identify more with the genuine and moderate left wing that he remembers, as opposed to the modern perversion of it that only mirrors the worst characteristics of the far right they decry.
The people who consider themselves the most liberal have abandoned Israel, which was always a liberal darling, for the people who, a terrorist organization, the people who outwardly say they want a genocide.
I think you talk about that. Like last week, you really hit with the gender apartheid.
Yes.
And talking about a lot of these issues, and some of the most progressive and left parts of the Democratic Party are standing, for the kind of side that have kinds of organizations like Hamas or these kind of nations that there are no rights for women, and they certainly don't embrace the LGBTQ kinds of lifestyle.
That's true, isn't it? Just goes to show much of the modern left's not as interested in problems as it is politicizing and capitalizing on those problems for political gain. And that's honestly the worst kind of politicization that exists, because it turns innocent and suffering people as mere pawns and talking points, which is what we see happen in an America where people in the working class are crying out for help and representation in the highest echelons of public office, as the economy and financial systems are left shaken by the wars and pandemic they've been through. And John Fetterman is someone that has spent many decades in those high offices and understands where it's going wrong from the inside out. For example, he was left completely flabbergasted at proposals and discussions in his home state that spotters should be given temporary legal rights. If you don't know what they are, spotters are basically people, usually illegal migrants in places like Texas and Georgia, who illegally occupy other people's houses while their residents are away for a few days or weeks, and live in those houses on the justification that they have nowhere else to go. That frustrated John Fetterman enough to come out with a pretty clear response saying this, and I quote, "Squatters have no rights. How can you even pretend that this is anything other than you're just breaking the law? It's wild that if you go away on a long trip for 30 days and someone breaks into your home, they suddenly have rights." And it is because it gives you a small window into just how far gone some members in his own party are, that they'd be occupied with this issue that shouldn't even need to be debated. And all this while they champion rights and freedoms from people all the way in the Middle East and in Ukraine, not realizing the dire calls that their own constituents are making for their own safety, scrutiny, and livelihoods. But in the end, don't get the impression that John Fetterman's going to leave the party anytime soon. Here's what he said in response to a question about Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the upcoming election. Perhaps it reveals that while John Fetterman is still very much a Democrat, he may be starting to carve out a larger space in the party for the more old-school liberals that he more identifies with.
As he is not yet officially the nominee of the Democratic Party, is he really the best one for them to put forward?
Joe Biden?
Yeah.
He's actually the only American that's ever beat Trump in an election, and I do honestly believe that he's actually the only Democrat that could win. Trump is pretty tough, and that's what the Republicans want. And I can't imagine why he's still appealing right now. But Trump has a very, and I do believe Joe Biden has that ability to win.
You can take that as you will, but it's still a welcome change that there's at least some intellectual shuffle happening in the Democratic Party, as some members realize that it's really going too far in the direction of identity politics and pointless virtue signaling. That's true, we're probably going to see more people like John Fetterman speak out and disagree, and that's ultimately going to be a net positive for democracy, free speech, and the political culture at large.